This is the account of the very last creative window Freddie Mercury ever opened, and the unfinished verses that compelled his bandmates to carry his legacy forward. Between May 13th and May 22nd of 1991, Freddie retreated to a small room in Montreux, Switzerland, to face his final silence after a life spent commanding the world's largest stadiums. These sessions for the song Mother Love marked the final time he would ever step foot inside a recording studio. Mountain Studios served as the backdrop for this moment, located inside the local casino building right on the edge of Lake Geneva. During his final years, this facility became a sanctuary where the London press could not reach him, and the locals treated him with enough respect that he could walk the streets in peace.
There must be more to life than this. There must be more to life than this. How do we cope in a world without love?
In some ways it's good, and obviously there are some drawbacks. But I think Queen is the sort of group that can put on a big show. It seems we work quite well in that context, whereas not all groups do.
And not all groups manage themselves by any means.
Producer David Richards worked hard to maintain this atmosphere, ensuring Freddie felt comfortable enough to push himself as far as his health would allow. By the spring of 1991, his physical decline was obvious, and he needed a cane to walk the short distance from his car to the studio doors. Since his energy was so limited, they abandoned the traditional method of recording in a glass isolation booth. David Richards set up a microphone right in the control room instead, which allowed Freddie to sit or stand just inches away from the mixing desk and the rest of the band. This setup created a sense of brotherhood that anchored the sessions, because Freddie wanted to stay in the heart of the creative process for as long as he could stand. He told his inner circle that he intended to work until the very end, and staying in the control room let him participate in every decision without the strain of moving around.
Yes, you could have gone for a sort of heavy metal approach or something more obvious, but this seemed like a sort of new direction for us and keep things interesting for us.
A major shift occurred in the music Freddie wanted to create during those final days. He moved away from the loud rock anthems and high-energy pop that defined his work in the mid-'80s. He asked for an atmospheric style that mirrored his own reflective state of mind, focusing on textures of sound that captured peace and longing rather than the bright lights of the stage. Brian May remembered how disciplined Freddie remained during this time, as he insisted on recording even when he could only stand for a few minutes. When he had to stop and rest, he would eventually come back with a shot of vodka and tell Brian to give him more lyrics to sing. It seemed he was determined to put everything he had into the microphone before his time ran out. The inspiration for the haunting arrangement of Mother Love actually came from an unlikely source.
Because it's what we do, you know, and it's not really a case of money, it's a case of sort of achievement.
During these sessions, the band found themselves influenced by the moody sound of Chris Isaak and his hit song, Wicked Game. Freddie and Brian wanted to capture that same sense of space, so they stripped away the heavy production to let the vocal performance take center stage. Writing the song was a spontaneous process, as Brian May and Freddie co-wrote the piece while the tape was rolling. Brian sat with a notebook and scratched out lines, handing them to Freddie one by one as they finished them. This showed the urgency they all felt because they knew they were working against a clock that was winding down. The physical objects left behind from these sessions are some of the most moving items in rock history.
And we could all do solo albums, you know, quite soon, but I think Queen will still be together. The moment that we find that there's nothing else to do within Queen, then we'll think differently.
Yeah.
Many of the lyrics were drafted on whatever scraps of paper happened to be within reach when inspiration struck. One famous example is a lyric sheet written on the back of a page containing the lyrics to Wicked Game, which had been printed out for reference. These handwritten notes are now on display for fans at the Queen Studio Experience exhibition in Montreux. Looking at the hurried handwriting and the crossed-out words shows the focused energy Freddie brought to his work. Even as he faced his own death, he cared most about the quality of the art he was leaving behind. Every line Freddie sang during those sessions was recorded with the heavy knowledge that there might never be a second chance to get it right.
There must be more to life than this. There must be more to life than this. How do we cope in a world without love?
Despite his physical decline, he remained committed to his long-standing rule of providing 3 distinct takes for every vocal line. He wanted to ensure that the band had enough material to create the perfect mix even after he was gone. Brian May later recalled how difficult it was to watch his friend give everything to a song he knew he would never hear in its finished form. This work was becoming a vital bridge between the life Freddie had lived and the legacy the band would carry forward. The studio environment was defined by a quiet focus, where the reality of his health was understood but rarely discussed. Even with the clock ticking, they maintained a professional standard that matched the work they produced during their most successful years.
I wondered if the fact that you manage yourselves and you have your own recording studios and your own companies and things, is that why you've managed to stay very steadily on the top for the last 10 years without really having to compromise?
It's hard to say.
Because it's what we do, you know, and it's not really a case of money, it's a case of sort of achievement.
Freddie refused to let his condition lower the quality of the music, and the vocal power he displayed on these tracks is nothing short of a miracle. Hearing him hit those high notes while his lungs were failing is a haunting experience for anyone who understands the physical effort involved in singing. It seemed as though the music itself gave him the strength to continue, turning the studio into a place where the spirit mattered more than the body. The influence of Chris Isaak went beyond just the tempo of the song because the band wanted to capture a specific feeling of cinematic loneliness. Brian May was fascinated by how that music used space and reverb to create an atmosphere that felt both expansive and deeply intimate.
And we could all do solo albums, you know, quite soon, but I think Queen will still be together. The moment that we find that there's nothing else to do within Queen, then we'll think differently.
Yeah.
He wanted to give Freddie a musical landscape that felt like a wide-open horizon, where his voice could stand alone without being crowded by heavy production. This approach made Mountain Studios a place of reflection, where the emotional honesty of the vocal was the only priority. They spent hours studying the texture of those sparse guitar lines to translate that sense of isolation into the world of Queen. This creative period was defined by a rapid writing style that the two men had never really attempted before. Since Freddie could only record for short bursts of time, Brian May had to act as a lyrical architect who built the song while Freddie waited at the microphone. Brian would sit on the studio floor or lean over the console to scribble down lines as they came to his mind. As soon as a couplet was finished, he would hand the paper over so Freddie could immediately begin finding the right phrasing. There was no time for rehearsals or for Freddie to live with the lyrics for a few days to learn their meaning. This was creation in its most immediate form, where the ink was often still wet on the page when the recording light turned red.
Yes, we could have gone for a sort of heavy metal approach or something more obvious, but this seemed like a sort of new direction for us and keep things interesting for us.
The scraps of paper from these sessions are now some of the most studied documents in rock history because they represent the final evidence of Freddie's creative process. One famous example is a printed lyric sheet for the song Wicked Game that Brian May happened to have in the studio. In the heat of the moment, Brian flipped that sheet over and used the blank side to write the words Freddie was about to sing. This physical connection between two different songs shows just how spontaneous the Mother Love sessions really were. These were not the polished manuscripts of a man with years of time left, but the urgent notes of a team working against the inevitable. Looking at those papers today, the revisions and hasty scribbles suggest a profound sense of urgency in every stroke of the pen. The handwritten drafts are now kept at the Queen, the Studio Experience exhibition, which sits inside the same building that once housed Mountain Studios in Montreux. For fans who travel to this site, seeing these papers under glass brings the reality of those final days into sharp focus. The exhibition keeps the lighting low to protect the fragile ink, and this dim atmosphere makes the room feel like a sacred space.
In some ways it's good, and obviously there are some drawbacks. But I think Queen is the sort of group that can put on a big show. It seems we work quite well in that context, whereas not all groups do.
And not all groups manage themselves by any means.
Visitors can spot exactly where Freddie's handwriting loses its steady flow, or where Brian May changed a rhyme to help Freddie breathe through the phrase. These artifacts act as a permanent bridge back to that week in May of 1991, allowing the public to see the moment the legendary singer prepared his final gift. What were once functional studio notes have become relics of a lost era, showing how a small scrap of paper can carry the weight of a massive legacy. This spontaneous way of writing was more than just a technical fix, and it reflected the deep trust that had grown between the singer and his guitarist over 20 years. Freddie was essentially placing his final artistic thoughts into the hands of Brian May, trusting him to find words for a vulnerability that Freddie usually hid behind his flamboyant stage persona. By accepting these lines and singing them without any hesitation, Freddie performed a quiet act of surrender that allowed Brian to begin the work of carrying the band forward. This exchange of papers back and forth between the two men became the final choreography of their long professional lives. It was a silent agreement that the music had to continue, even if the voice that defined it was about to go silent. Every time Brian offered a new line, he was feeding a fire that Freddie was determined to keep burning until the very end. Because of this urgency, the studio atmosphere lacked the slow perfectionism that usually defined Queen recordings in the past.
I wondered if the fact that you manage yourselves and you have your own recording studios and your own companies and things, is that why you've managed to stay very steadily on the top for the last 10 years without really having to compromise?
It's hard to say.
There was no room for ego or arguments over small details, as everyone in the room shared the single goal of capturing Freddie's voice while he could still reach those famous notes. This spontaneity revealed a different side of his talent, which relied on raw instinct rather than a calculated performance. He was singing from a place of pure emotion while being guided by the words that Brian provided in real time. A sense of discovery filled the room for both men as they heard the song come to life at the exact moment it was recorded. This high-stakes gamble resulted in one of the most honest performances of his career, proving his artistic intuition remained sharp even as his body grew weak. The evolution of the lyrics found on those handwritten scraps reveals a man who was actively shaping his own legacy as the clock ran down. When looking closely at the early drafts, the phrase "lonely lane" originally appeared as a statement of defiance against his isolation. The first thought written on the page suggested that he did not want to walk in this lonely lane, which hinted at a desire to return to his old life in London. However, when the recording started, the words shifted into a more resigned and honest admission of his current reality. The final version states that he has walked too long in this lonely lane, reflecting a deep acceptance of the solitude his illness had forced upon him.
Because it's what we do, you know, and it's not really a case of money, it's a case of sort of achievement.
This change is not just a lyrical fix, but a window into a psychological shift from fighting the inevitable to finding peace within it. Maintaining the 3 takes rule throughout the entire recording process was a point of pride for Freddie, even as his physical health continued to fail. He sang every single line at least 3 different ways to ensure the band had everything they needed for the years ahead. His first priority was providing a version that was powerful and direct, followed by a take that was more vulnerable, and finally one that explored a different melodic path. This was his final gift to the remaining members of Queen, giving them a wealth of options to build a perfect final performance after he was gone. It was a methodical and selfless way to work, ensuring his final artistic statement would be as close to perfection as possible without him there to supervise the final mix.
In some ways it's good, and obviously there are some drawbacks. But I think Queen is the sort of group that can put on a big show. It seems we work quite well in that context, whereas not all groups do.
And not all groups manage themselves by any means.
Brian May and Roger Taylor often recalled the incredible feeling in the control room, describing it as a state of absolute awe. Even though Freddie usually had to sit down or lean on a chair to stay upright, the voice coming out of him sounded exactly like the one that filled Wembley Stadium. Roger Taylor specifically remembered the middle section of the song, where Freddie hits a massive high note that seemed to ignore his physical condition entirely. That experience was described by Roger as spine-chilling, because nobody could understand how Freddie found that kind of strength so late in his life. It seemed like singing was the only thing keeping him connected to who he used to be, and he never allowed his standards to drop for a single second. One specific line in this vocal performance defines how Freddie felt during those final months, as he made it clear that he wanted no pity from anyone. This was the guiding principle of his life at the time, and he worked incredibly hard to keep his private pain out of the newspapers. He knew the world would eventually see him through the lens of his illness, so he used his music to set firm boundaries. Freddie refused to be remembered as a tragic figure or a target for tabloid sympathy, and he used this recording to announce that position to the public.
Must be more to life than this. There must be more to life than this. How do we cope in a world without love?
By singing those words with such power, he reclaimed his own story and insisted that his work should define his life rather than his health. The lyrics for Mother Love were a joint effort between the two friends, with Brian May building the framework that allowed Freddie to express these heavy emotions. Brian felt a massive responsibility to write words that were worthy of what would become Freddie's final performance. Their interaction was a natural and delicate process where Brian would suggest a line, and Freddie would immediately know how to bring it to life. This deep connection was built over 20 years of working together, allowing them to use music to say things that were too difficult to speak aloud. The song became a container for their history and mutual respect, catching a moment that felt both heartbreaking and perfect. Before we continue into how Freddie spent his final hours in the studio to ensure his story ended on his own terms, which Queen song do you think best captures the unique bond between him and Brian May?
And we could all do solo albums, quite soon, but I think Queen will still be together. The moment that we find that there's nothing else to do within Queen, then we'll think differently.
Yeah.
Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you are enjoying this story so far, hitting like and subscribing really helps us keep making content like this. Now, let's carry on. Freddie was fully aware that he was reaching the end of a journey that began in the early 70s, and his main goal was to finish that story properly. Every take he recorded and every lyric he tweaked was a deliberate step toward a conclusion he was determined to get right. His ability to maintain his artistic integrity while facing death is a powerful example of the strength of his spirit. Mother Love is a vital part of the Queen legacy because it proves his genius was still there until the moment the tape stopped. He left a clear plan for his own memory, trusting his bandmates to finish the work he could no longer do himself.
Yes, you could have gone for a sort of heavy metal approach or something more obvious, but this seemed like a sort of new direction for us and keep things interesting for us.
A deep sense of exhaustion filled the room after the second verse was finished, and that turned out to be the exact moment the music stopped forever. Freddie reached the end of the section about finding comfort and peace, and he realized he had used up every bit of his energy for the day. Looking at Brian May, he said the last words he would ever speak inside a recording studio. Telling Brian that he was not feeling up to it anymore, he promised to come back and finish the song tomorrow. It was a normal thing for a musician to say, but those words carry a massive weight because that tomorrow never actually came for the band. Freddie left the quiet safety of Montreux shortly after that session to return to his garden lodge home in London. Traveling back to Switzerland was no longer possible as he never regained his strength, so the sessions that had been so productive were suddenly frozen in time. Processing their own grief was difficult enough, but the band also had to accept that Freddie would never walk into Mountain Studios again.
I wondered if the fact that you manage yourselves and you have your own recording studios and your own companies and things, is that why you've managed to stay very steadily on the top for the last 10 years without really having to compromise?
It's hard to say.
For Brian May, Roger Taylor, and John Deacon, those final vocal takes were both a precious gift and a source of deep pain. These recordings stayed in the archives for 4 years because the surviving members could not find a way to work on them without being overwhelmed. Brian May has often mentioned how painful it was to hear Freddie's voice through the studio speakers during those first few years after he died. The project sat on a shelf until 1995, when the surviving members of Queen finally felt capable of facing those unfinished recordings for the Made in Heaven album. Returning to the studio to complete Mother Love required a specific kind of emotional strength, because they had to work with a voice that could no longer answer them. When they reached the third verse of the song, the reality of the situation became clear as Freddie had never actually recorded the vocals for that section. The track lacked a conclusion, leaving a gap that the band needed to address to protect the integrity of the work. This forced them into a difficult creative choice regarding the silence Freddie left behind when he walked out of the studio for the last time. Brian May eventually made the decision to step up to the microphone himself to sing that final verse, which transformed the track into a literal passing of the torch. By taking over the lead vocal at the exact moment Freddie's recording stopped, Brian built a symbolic bridge that connected their shared past to an uncertain future. This was not just a convenient fix for an incomplete song, but a statement that the band would now serve as the protectors of Freddie's legacy. Hearing Brian's voice come out of the silence right after Freddie's last note remains one of the most moving moments in the history of the band. It captures the very second that the responsibility for the music shifted from the creator to the friends who would guard it for decades. Standing in the same physical space where Freddie had given his final performance was an experience Brian described as both haunting and deeply meaningful. He worked to match the heavy atmosphere and vocal intensity of Freddie's takes while still offering his own perspective on the lyrics. The transition between their two voices sounds smooth, yet remains distinct, so the listener can feel the presence of both men within the same piece of music. This creative direction ensured that Mother Love served as more than a tribute, becoming a collaboration that ignored the traditional boundaries of time. It allowed the song to reach a conclusion that felt both natural and earned, proving their bond was strong enough to survive their final separation. The process of finishing these tapes acted as a form of therapy for the group, as it gave them a few more months to spend with Freddie's creative energy. They approached the work with the same meticulous attention to detail that Freddie always expected, treating every single breath and syllable with genuine respect. The final recording sounds as if it were always intended to be a duet across different years, capturing the brotherhood that defined Queen. By the time they finished the track, they had created something that effectively closed the circle on the most important chapter of their lives. The silence of those missing lyrics was replaced by a chorus that would ensure Freddie's voice never truly faded away. Blending a vocal from 1991 with a full production from 1995 presented a massive technical challenge, but David Richards and the band were committed to making it sound perfect. They focused on keeping the raw emotion of the final takes while building a musical setting large enough for a band known for playing stadiums. Every time they moved the faders up to hear Freddie's voice, it felt like he had returned to the room to work with them one last time. This entire process was their way of saying a long and final goodbye through the music they had spent their lives creating together. They were not just finishing an album, they were building a monument to a man who had dedicated everything to his art. When the song finally moves from the verse Brian sang into the complex outro, the scale of what they achieved becomes obvious to anyone listening. It is a moment of total musical release that allows the listener to feel the weight of a long history finally coming to a close. They chose to let the music carry the message, avoiding any excessive sentimentality that might have made the experience feel cheap or forced. Instead, they focused on the hard reality of their loss and the beauty of the art that managed to survive it. This was the moment when Mother Love stopped being a simple song and became a definitive historical record. It stands as the final word on a musical partnership that changed rock music forever. Brian and Roger wanted the finale of Mother Love to serve as a complete retrospective, so they searched the archives for the earliest moments of Freddie's career. They eventually settled on a small sample from a 1972 recording of the song Goin' Back, which Freddie had performed under the name Larry Lurex at Trident Studios in London. This specific session took place before the first Queen album even existed, making it the first time his voice was ever captured on professional studio tape. Placing this vintage vocal at the very end of his final song created a perfect artistic loop that closed his career in the same room where it began. It was a way of returning the man to the boy, bringing a sense of completion to a life that had moved at such a frantic and successful pace. Back during those Trident sessions, Freddie was just a young man experimenting with his craft long before he became a global icon. Hearing that youthful, bright voice immediately after the weathered performance of 1991 is a haunting experience for any dedicated listener. After this nostalgic callback, the track shifts into a rapid sonic history of everything the band had achieved over 2 decades. Brian and Roger constructed a dizzying time-lapse montage where snippets of every song they ever recorded play back in a blurred sequence. It creates the sensation of a life passing before your ears as the massive anthems of the 70s and 80s rush past in seconds. This complex achievement requires the listener to process 20 years of musical evolution in a single moment of high-speed reflection. Layering hundreds of individual tracks ensured Mother Love was seen as the final chapter of a monumental volume of work. This approach honored the love Freddie always had for studio experimentation and his desire to push the boundaries of what a rock song could be. Eventually, the montage gives way to a familiar sound that brings the listener back to the absolute peak of Queen's live power. They included the iconic I.O. call and response from the 1986 Wembley Stadium concert, allowing Freddie's voice to ring out one last time over a cheering crowd. This transition from the quiet intimacy of a Swiss studio to the roar of 100,000 fans serves as a final reminder of his massive impact. Right after this burst of energy, the sound of a baby crying emerges from the mix to symbolize the eternal cycle of life. It was a deliberate choice to end this story on a note of rebirth rather than death, suggesting that a new generation would carry the legacy forward. These structural choices by Brian and Roger are what transformed a simple 1991 recording session into a definitive career summary. They were not just filling space at the end of a track, but were instead curating a final experience that summarized everything Freddie had been to the world. Stitching his very first professional recording to his very last gave the fans a sense of closure that felt both natural and profound. This turned Mother Love into a musical museum of his life, proving his presence could be felt across every era of the band. It highlights the incredible journey he took from a shy student in London to a performer who commanded the attention of billions. The group wanted to remind everyone that even the greatest stars have humble beginnings, and that his talent was present from the moment he first stepped behind a microphone. This connection between his earliest and latest work gives the song its unique power as a summary of a life well lived. Mother Love acts as a deliberate link between the years of Freddie leading the band and the future his friends would have to navigate alone. Since Freddie could no longer be physically present, Brian May had to step in and find his own voice to finish the story his friend began. Leaving the track in their hands showed how much Freddie trusted them, which is why the song still feels so heavy for the band and the fans today. The recording preserves the voice of a man who knew his time was short but decided to spend those remaining hours building something for the people staying behind. Every note reflects the deep connection that kept the 4 members of Queen united through their massive successes and their darkest moments. The pages of handwritten lyrics from these sessions are now kept in protected locations ranging from the studio in Montreux to the house in Zanzibar where Freddie was born. These documents mark the end of a creative journey that lasted 20 years and changed music, proving that Freddie never lost his focus on the work. Even as his physical strength faded, his vocal performance remained a gift that showed his creative spirit stayed strong until his last breath. Freddie left the stage at the peak of his talent, providing a final recording that sounds incredible while feeling completely heartbreaking at the same time. The fact that Freddie never finished the track himself creates a special impact because those missing verses tell the story of the band better than any polished song could. Brian, Roger, and John had to move out from behind their frontman to become the protectors of his memory. We should not remember Freddie for how he left us, but for the immense strength he displayed while he was still creating. By leaving his friends with these unfinished pieces, he gave them a task that would keep the name of Queen alive for as long as people listen to music. These recordings show that the end of a life is just the moment where the listeners take over the job of keeping a person's memory alive. Looking back at the time in Mountain Studios shows a man who felt driven to leave behind a great record despite his illness. The band used the work Freddie did during those weeks in May as a guide for every decision they made after he was gone. They respected his desire for a personal sound and were careful to only add what was needed to finish the tracks. This approach kept Mother Love sounding like an honest look at a legend when he was at his most vulnerable. When the sounds of the crying baby and the cheering Wembley crowd disappear, you are left with the same peace Freddie found in his house by the lake. His work was finished and his gift was ready for the world he loved to hear. Freddie Mercury finally reached the end of that lonely lane he sang about, but the path he left behind stays open for everyone who follows.